There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over the open ocean just before dawn, when the wind has not yet decided which way it wants to blow, when the water turns the color of hammered pewter, and when a ship, alone on the curve of the earth, seems to hang suspended between two worlds. It was in moments like these, somewhere off the coast of a continent that Europe had not yet named, that a quiet, watchful Englishman would take out a notebook wrapped in tarred cloth to keep the salt water from ruining the pages, and begin to write. He was not a king. He was not a nobleman. He held no grand commission from any crown when his journey began, and yet, by the time his life had run its course, William Dampier would become the first Englishman to set foot upon the shores of Australia, the first person in history to circumnavigate the globe, not once, but 3 separate times, and one of the most quietly influential figures in the entire story of how humanity came to understand its own planet. He was, in the truest sense, a man who helped draw the map the rest of the world would later follow. To call Dampier simply an explorer would be to miss the strange and fascinating contradictions that made him who he was. He was, at various points in his extraordinary life, a sailor, a buccaneer, a privateer sailing under letters that blurred the line between patriot and pirate, a naturalist who filled his journals with careful sketches of plants and animals no European had ever seen, a meteorologist before that word existed, an ethnographer who wrote with unusual respect about the peoples he encountered, and finally, an author whose books would outsell almost anything else published in England at the time. Daniel Defoe is believed to have drawn inspiration from Dampier's voyages and stranded sailors when crafting Robinson Crusoe. Jonathan Swift, in turn, leaned on Dampier's vivid, matter-of-fact style of travel writing when he sent Lemuel Gulliver out to sea. In other words, 2 of the most enduring works of English literature owe a quiet debt to a real sailor's real notebooks. But Dampier's influence reached far beyond fiction. His observations on wind patterns and ocean currents were so precise, so meticulously recorded, that they would go on to shape the science of oceanography itself. Words he coined or popularized, terms like barbecue, avocado, and subspecies, slipped quietly into the English language and never left. Captain James Cook, more than half a century later, carried Dampier's charts and writings with him as he prepared for his own voyages into the Pacific. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. In a very real sense, before the world had agreed on what its oceans even looked like, William Dampier was already out there, alone with a notebook, filling in the blank spaces. And yet, for all of this, Dampier remains one of history's most underappreciated figures. A man whose name does not roll off the tongue the way Magellan's or Cook's might, despite arguably matching or exceeding their contributions to global exploration. Perhaps this is because his life resists easy categorization. He was, at times, genuinely a pirate, sailing with men who looted Spanish galleons and raided coastal towns. And yet that same man, in the same breath, in the same cramped quarters below deck, would carefully press a flower between the pages of his journal so that botanists back in London might one day study it. He could be ruthless in pursuit of plunder and tender in his curiosity about the natural world, sometimes within the very same week. In the chapters that follow, we will walk slowly through the full arc of this remarkable life, from his quiet beginnings in the English countryside, through his years among the buccaneers of the Caribbean, into the uncharted waters of the Pacific and the unfamiliar shores of Australia, through shipwreck and mutiny and the writing of the books that would make him famous, and finally to the quiet, complicated legacy he left behind. There is no need to rush. His was a life that unfolded across decades and oceans, and it deserves to be told the same way, patiently, thoughtfully, with the same careful attention to detail that Dampier himself brought to every page of his own remarkable journals. So let the water settle. Let the wind decide which way it wants to blow. And let us begin, as he so often did, at the very edge of the known world. To understand how a man comes to map the world, it is worth beginning somewhere far smaller, a single farmhouse in a single quiet village in the rolling green countryside of Somerset, England. The village was called East Coker, and in the autumn of 1651, in a modest tenant farmhouse known as Hymerford House, a boy was born who would, by the time his life had ended, have seen more of the earth's surface than almost any other Englishman who had ever lived. His parents named him William. There was nothing in his earliest years to suggest the scale of what was coming. His father worked the land as a tenant farmer, leasing his fields from a local family of some standing, the Helliers, and by all accounts the Dampiers lived the steady, unremarkable rhythm of rural English life. Planting, harvesting, attending the parish church, watching the seasons turn. Young William was sent to school, and those who later wrote about him noted that he showed an early gift for mathematics, the kind of quiet aptitude that, in another life, might have made him a surveyor or a merchant's clerk. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans, and it announced them cruelly. When William was around 14 years old, his father died. It was not long before his mother followed him to the grave as well, leaving William and his siblings without parents and without the steady income the farm had once provided, in an age with no safety net beyond the goodwill of relatives and guardians. This was the kind of loss that could end a childhood overnight, and for William Dampier, it did exactly that. His formal education came to a close. The quiet, predictable path he might have walked, a life of fields and ledgers in Somerset, closed gently behind him, and an entirely different door swung open instead. His guardians, perhaps sensing that the orphaned boy needed both a trade and a way to support himself, arranged for him to be apprenticed to a shipmaster in the port town of Weymouth on England's southern coast. It is worth pausing here, because this single decision, made not by William himself, but by the adults responsible for his welfare after tragedy had struck, would set the entire shape of the centuries to come. Had he been apprenticed to a baker, or a tailor, or a clerk, the history of exploration might read entirely differently today. Instead, he was placed before the sea, and the sea, it turned out, was patiently waiting for him. His very first voyage took him not to anywhere warm or exotic, but to the cold, fog-bound fishing grounds off Newfoundland, where English ships sailed each year to harvest cod from the teeming North Atlantic waters. It was brutal, freezing work, and young Dampier, still a teenager, found it thoroughly miserable. He would later write candidly that he disliked the cold so intensely that he very nearly abandoned the sea altogether after that single voyage. It is a small, almost humorous detail in the life of a man who would go on to cross the equator more times than most sailors of his era, that his very first taste of maritime life left him questioning whether this was the life for him at all. But the sea, having claimed him once, was not finished. Not long after returning from Newfoundland, Dampier signed on for a voyage of an entirely different character, one bound not for the grey Atlantic, but for the East Indies, sailing aboard a merchant vessel toward the Spice Islands of what is now Indonesia. This voyage exposed him to something the Newfoundland trip never could have: warmth, color, unfamiliar trade winds, ports filled with goods and peoples from across Asia, and his first real glimpse of how vast and varied the world truly was beyond the shores of England. Something in him seems to have shifted during this voyage. The cold misery of his first trip gave way to a growing fascination with distant places, distant peoples, and distant skies. A fascination that would define the rest of his life. When he returned to England, the world itself was at war. England and the Dutch Republic were locked in what historians now call the Third Anglo-Dutch War, a conflict fought largely at sea over trade routes and naval supremacy. Like many young Englishmen with maritime experience, Dampier was drawn into service, joining the Royal Navy and finding himself aboard a powerful warship under the command of an experienced admiral. He took part in fierce naval engagements against the Dutch fleet, the kind of close-range, smoke-filled, cannon-roaring battles that defined 17th-century naval warfare. It was dangerous, chaotic work, and Dampier, falling seriously ill partway through his service, was eventually put ashore to recover. He would later learn that the very commander he had served under was killed in action not long afterward, drowned when his ship was lost in battle. Dampier's illness, in a strange twist of fortune, may well have saved his life. Recovered but restless, and, with the steady, structured discipline of naval life behind him, Dampier made a choice that would carry him across the Atlantic and toward the chapter of his life that truly began to set him apart from ordinary sailors. He traveled to Jamaica, drawn by the promise of opportunity in England's growing Caribbean colonies, and took up work managing a sugar plantation. It did not suit him. The plantation life, for all its profitability for the men who owned the land, was tedious and confining for a young man who had already tasted the wide horizons of the East Indies and the chaos of naval battle. He lasted only a matter of months before abandoning the plantation altogether in search of something else. What he found instead was the logwood trade, and it is here, in the steaming, mosquito-thick swamps of the Bay of Campeche along the coast of what is now Mexico, that William Dampier's transformation truly began. Logwood was an unglamorous but valuable commodity, a tree whose dark heartwood produced a rich dye prized by the textile makers of Europe. Cutting it was punishing labor, performed in remote, lawless coastal camps far from any governing authority, populated by a rough and varied assortment of adventurers, runaways, deserters, and men who had simply drifted to the very edges of the colonial world and decided to stay there. It was, in every sense, a frontier, and frontiers in the 17th century tended to attract a particular kind of person, resourceful, self-reliant, comfortable with danger, and largely indifferent to the rules that governed life back in England. It was here, among the logwood cutters of Campeche, that Dampier first encountered the loose, shifting world of Caribbean buccaneers, men who drifted between legitimate trade, opportunistic raiding, and outright piracy depending on the politics of the moment and the ships they happened to encounter. Dampier observed them closely, the same way he observed everything, with that quiet, careful attention that filled his notebooks. He noted their customs, their methods, their unusual code of conduct, the strange democratic fairness with which many buccaneer crews divided their plunder and chose their captains. He was, even at this early stage, already behaving less like a participant and more like a naturalist, studying a fascinating and dangerous species in its native habitat. But observation alone could not sustain a man indefinitely in such a place, and by the closing years of the 1670s, Dampier found himself drawn fully into the buccaneering life he had spent so long quietly studying. The logwood camps were temporary by nature, the colonial authorities increasingly hostile to the loose communities that had sprung up along the coast, and opportunity, for a man with Dampier's restless curiosity and growing seamanship, lay not in cutting trees but in joining the ships that came and went along that same lawless coastline. Somewhere in this transition, not a single dramatic moment, but a slow drift from one world into another. The farmer's son from Somerset, the boy who had once sworn off the sea after a miserable voyage to Newfoundland, became something else entirely, a buccaneer, sailing toward the Isthmus of Panama, and toward an ocean that very few Englishmen of his time had ever laid eyes upon. By now, William Dampier stood at a threshold, no longer the orphaned farm boy from Somerset, no longer quite a sailor in any conventional sense, but something newer and rougher, a buccaneer, drifting at the edge of England's Caribbean world, watching the lawless logwood coast give way to something far more dangerous and far more vast. What lay ahead of him was not simply another voyage. It was an entire ocean that almost no Englishman had ever seen with his own eyes, and the path to reach it ran straight through one of the most punishing landscapes on Earth. In the spring of 6080, Dampier joined a band of several hundred buccaneers under a loose coalition of captains, men with names like Coxswain, Sawkins, and Sharp, each commanding his own following, each bound to the others only by shared ambition and the rough democratic code that governed buccaneer life. Their target was audacious, even by the standards of men who made a living from audacity. They intended to cross the Isthmus of Darien on foot, cut through one of the densest and most hostile jungles in the Americas, and emerge on the far side into the Pacific Ocean, where Spanish wealth flowed largely undefended, because no one had ever seriously imagined an enemy arriving from that direction. The crossing itself deserves to be understood not as a footnote, but as one of the great physical ordeals of Dampier's entire life. For days the buccaneers slogged through swamp and rainforest, wading rivers that rose without warning, hacking through undergrowth so thick that the sun rarely reached the jungle floor, sustained by what little food they could carry or barter from the indigenous Kuna people who lived along their route. People who, notably, regarded the Spanish as enemies and the English, for the moment, as something closer to allies. Dampier, true to the habit that defined him, kept his notebook dry and kept writing, recording the plants he passed, the customs of the people who fed and guided them, the calls of birds he had never heard before. Even exhausted, even frightened, even half-starved, he was still the same quiet observer who had studied the logwood camps of Campeche, simply transplanted now into the most demanding classroom imaginable. When the buccaneers finally broke through to the Pacific shore, they did something that must have felt almost unreal after weeks in the jungle. They seized small boats and canoes from local allies and simply paddled out to capture a Spanish ship at anchor, and from that single captured vessel built the beginnings of a small raiding fleet. The audacity of the plan was matched only by its success. Spanish settlements along the Pacific coast of Panama and Peru had never been built to withstand an attack from the sea behind them, and for a time the buccaneers moved almost unopposed, raiding ports, intercepting shipping, and accumulating plunder that, in the retelling decades later, would sound almost like legend. But buccaneer fleets were fragile things, held together by consent rather than command, and consent has a way of fraying under pressure. Leadership disputes broke out among the captains, as they so often did in these loosely organized companies, and the coalition that had crossed the isthmus together began to splinter. Bartholomew Sharp eventually emerged as the dominant figure among those who chose to remain in the Pacific, continuing to raid down the coast of South America before eventually rounding the storm-battered tip of Cape Horn and sailing home to the Caribbean, and, in time, to England itself, a voyage that would later place Sharp on trial for piracy in London, where he was, in one of the era's stranger legal outcomes, acquitted. Dampier, however, was not among those who sailed home with Sharp. He had grown uneasy with Sharp's leadership and judgment, and along with a smaller group of like-minded men, made the decision to do something almost as extraordinary as the original crossing: turn around and walk back across the isthmus the way they had come. It is worth sitting with the sheer audacity of this decision for a moment. These were men who had already endured one of the most grueling overland journeys imaginable, who had reached an ocean few Englishmen had ever seen, who had tasted real plunder, and rather than continue forward with a leader they distrusted, they chose to face that same brutal jungle, crossing a second time, in the opposite direction, with even less certainty of what awaited them on the other side. They suffered terribly. Food ran short, fevers spread. Some men did not survive the return journey at all, but Dampier did, emerging once again on the Caribbean coast, battered but very much alive, and carrying with him notebooks filled with observations that no European had ever recorded before. It would have been entirely reasonable, after such an ordeal, for a man to abandon the buccaneering life altogether and return quietly to England, to whatever safety and respectability his notebooks and his savings might purchase. For a brief while, it seems, Dampier did exactly that, spending time in Virginia and considering more settled pursuits. But the same restlessness that had carried him away from the Jamaican sugar plantation years earlier had not left him. The Pacific had shown him something he could not simply unsee, an ocean barely touched by English ships, dotted with islands no English mapmaker had ever charted, bordered by Spanish wealth and, somewhere beyond its far horizon, entire civilizations in Asia that Dampier had only glimpsed once before, briefly, as a young man bound for the East Indies. In 1683, that restlessness pulled him back to sea, this time aboard a ship called the Revenge, under the command of Captain John Cook, not to be confused with the far more famous Captain James Cook, who would not be born for several more decades, but who would, in time, study Dampier's own writings before setting out on his own voyages. Cook's expedition sailed first across the Atlantic toward the coast of West Africa, then turned south and west, braving the same brutal passage around Cape Horn that Sharp's fleet had taken in the opposite direction, and emerged once again into the vast, glittering expanse of the Pacific. This time not on foot, but under full sail, with an entire ocean ahead of them rather than behind. What followed was a long, sprawling campaign up and down the Pacific coast of the Americas, as Cook's ship joined forces with other buccaneer vessels under captains such as Edward Davis, forming, at times, a small fleet capable of threatening Spanish shipping and settlements across an enormous stretch of coastline. Dampier moved through these years the way he moved through all of them, present for the raids and the dangers, but never quite losing that separate, observing eye, filling page after page with notes on currents and winds, on the habits of unfamiliar fish and birds, on the geography of coastlines that simply did not yet exist on any European chart. He was, by this point, becoming something genuinely unusual in the history of exploration, a pirate who kept the meticulous records of a scientist, and a scientist who happened to be sailing under something uncomfortably close to a black flag. It was from this Pacific campaign, after further changes of ship and captain, that Dampier would eventually find himself aboard a vessel called the Signet, under Captain Charles Swan, setting a course not back toward the Americas, but directly westward, across the full breadth of the Pacific Ocean toward Asia. A decision that would carry him toward the Philippines, toward the islands of the East Indies he had once visited so briefly as a young man, and eventually toward a stretch of unmapped coastline that no Englishman had ever set eyes upon before. That coastline belonged to a vast, mysterious landmass. The Spanish and Dutch had only glimpsed in fragments, a place European maps left almost entirely blank, marked in places with little more than a guess and a shrug. The English would come to call it New Holland. Today, we know it as Australia, and it is there, on a remote stretch of its northwestern shore, that William Dampier would soon make history. Not with a sword or a cannon, but with the careful, patient curiosity that had defined him since he was a boy with a gift for mathematics in a Somerset schoolroom, watching, recording, and wondering about a world so much larger than the one he had been born into. When the Signet finally raised land on the 10th of January, 1688, the men aboard her had been sailing for weeks across open Pacific water, with nothing ahead of them but rumor and guesswork. What emerged from the haze was a low, sun-baked coastline unlike anything most of the crew had ever seen. Red earth, scrubby vegetation, an unfamiliar stillness in the air. They had reached the northwestern shore of New Holland, the vast, half-imagined continent that European charts depicted, if they depicted it at all, as little more than a dotted guess along the southern edge of the known world. William Dampier, stepping ashore near what is now King Sound in Western Australia, became one of the very first Englishmen in recorded history to set foot on Australian soil. True to the habit that had defined him since boyhood, Dampier did not simply pass through this strange new place. He stayed, observed, and wrote, producing some of the earliest detailed European descriptions of Australian plants, animals, and people that exist anywhere in the historical record. He described the local Aboriginal inhabitants, the unfamiliar trees, the strange fish pulled from the shallows, the heat, the flies, the dryness of the land, all of it recorded with the same careful, unhurried attention he had once given to the jungles of Darien and the ports of the East Indies. His account would later be read by scientists and naturalists across Europe, and centuries afterward, a cluster of islands off that same coastline would be named the Buccaneer Archipelago in quiet acknowledgement of the ship and the men who had drifted past them so long ago. It is worth pausing here to be honest about something. Dampier's writings about the Aboriginal people he encountered were, in places, dismissive and unflattering, shaped by the limited understanding and casual prejudices common to European sailors of his era. He did not approach them with the same generous curiosity he so often extended to plants, animals, and landscapes. This, too, is part of the historical record, and it sits uncomfortably alongside the genuine scientific value of his other observations. A reminder that even the most meticulous observer of his age remained, in many ways, a man entirely of his time. The Cygnet did not linger in New Holland for long. Fresh water and provisions were scarce along that stretch of coast, and Captain Swan, increasingly at odds with much of his crew over the direction and purpose of the voyage, eventually set sail again, carrying his men back out across open water toward the islands of Southeast Asia. The relationship between Dampier and Swan had been fraying for some time, and by the time the Cygnet reached the Nicobar Islands in the Bay of Bengal, Dampier had decided he had seen enough. He left the ship, by most accounts, slipping away with a small group of companions in a native canoe, trusting his own navigation and a sliver of good fortune over whatever the Cygnet's increasingly uncertain voyage still held in store. It was, even by Dampier's standards, an enormous gamble. A small open canoe, a handful of men, and hundreds of miles of unpredictable open water between them and the nearest reliable landfall on Sumatra. They survived a violent storm along the way, the kind of close brush with death that fills the quieter passages of Dampier's later writing with an unmistakable, hard-won gratitude. When they finally reached the Sumatran coast, exhausted and half-starved, Dampier did something that, in hindsight, reveals just how far his reputation as an observer and a capable, level-headed seaman had already begun to spread. Even among strangers, he found employment with the English East India Company, serving for a time as a gunner at the company's fort at Bencoolen, helping to maintain the modest defences of a remote and unhealthy outpost on the edge of England's expanding commercial reach into Asia. He remained in the region for roughly a year, restless as ever, before finally securing passage home aboard a returning East India Company vessel. When William Dampier set foot once more on English soil in September of 1691, he had been gone for more than a decade. He arrived with very little money, his fortunes from the buccaneering years long since spent or lost, but he carried something far more valuable in the long run: trunks of notebooks, charts, and specimens representing one of the most complete first-hand records of the wider world that any single Englishman had ever assembled. He had, without quite intending it at the outset, become the first Englishman to circumnavigate the entire globe 3 separate times over the course of his various voyages. Though it was this first, sprawling, accidental circumnavigation, stitched together from buccaneering campaigns and desperate escapes rather than any single planned expedition, that would first bring his name before the English public. Among the curiosities Dampier brought back with him was a man he called Prince Giolo, an individual from the Philippine or Moluccan Islands whose body was covered in elaborate tattoos, and in whom Dampier held a financial interest, having acquired and then sold a share of him as a kind of human exhibit to be displayed for paying audiences in London. It is an uncomfortable chapter, and an important one to acknowledge honestly rather than gloss over. Even a man whose curiosity about the natural and human world was, in many respects, genuinely ahead of his time, was not above treating another human being as a commercial curiosity when the opportunity presented itself. Giola's eventual fate after his arrival in England remains only partially documented, a quiet, sobering footnote within a much larger story of exploration and discovery. What followed for Dampier himself, however, was an almost complete transformation in his standing in English society. Rather than fading into obscurity, as so many returning sailors of modest means did, Dampier spent the years after his return carefully working his notebooks into a manuscript, organizing a decade of fragmentary observations, near disasters, and scientific curiosities into a single, coherent narrative of his travels. In 1697, that manuscript was published under the title A New Voyage Round the World, and its success was immediate and, by the standards of the time, genuinely remarkable. Readers across England devoured it. Here was a book written not by a nobleman or a court-appointed naturalist, but by a working sailor, a man who had crossed oceans, walked through some of the most hostile jungle on earth, fought in naval battles, raided Spanish settlements, and still found time to carefully describe the migratory patterns of unfamiliar birds and the precise color of an unfamiliar fruit. The voice on the page was plain, clear, and utterly without pretension, and that plainness was, in its own way, revolutionary. It read less like a boastful adventure tale and more like the patient notes of a man genuinely trying to help his readers understand a world they would otherwise never see. The book's success opened doors that had never before been opened to William Dampier. He was received in scientific and intellectual circles that would have been entirely closed to a former buccaneer just a few years earlier. Members of the Royal Society took an interest in his observations. Naval officials, normally inclined to view former pirates with deep suspicion, instead began to view Dampier as something genuinely valuable, a man with more practical knowledge of the Pacific Ocean, its currents, its winds, and its largely unmapped coastlines than perhaps any other Englishman alive. It was an extraordinary reversal of fortune for a man who, only a few years earlier, had been slipping away from a half-mutinous ship in a stolen canoe, uncertain whether he would survive the week. That reversal would soon carry Dampier to the most official, most legitimate command of his entire career. Not a buccaneer's makeshift authority granted by the loose consent of a raiding crew, but an actual commission from the English Admiralty itself, placing him at the head of a Royal Navy vessel and sending him back across the world's oceans on a mission of genuine scientific discovery. The destination, fittingly, was the very coastline he had glimpsed so briefly years before, the vast and largely unmapped shores of New Holland. And this time, William Dampier would not be slipping ashore as a fugitive buccaneer, stealing a few hours to fill his notebook before the tide turned. It would be sailing as the commander of his own ship, with the full weight and purpose of an officially sanctioned voyage of exploration behind him, ready to map, in far greater detail than ever before, the strange and beautiful continent that had first caught his attention from the deck of the Signet. There is something quietly poetic about the way history sometimes hands a man exactly the chance he has spent his whole life preparing for, and then takes it away from him almost as soon as it arrives. That was the shape of William Dampier's next great voyage, the one commission of his entire career granted not by the loose consent of a buccaneer crew, but by the English Admiralty itself, placing him in formal command of a Royal Navy vessel and sending him back toward the very coastline that had first captured his imagination more than a decade earlier. In January of 699, Dampier set sail aboard His Majesty's ship Roebuck, bound for New Holland, carrying with him official instructions to chart, observe, and report on a continent that European science still understood only in fragments. For a man who had spent years slipping ashore as a fugitive, stealing brief hours to fill his notebooks before a half-mutinous crew demanded he return to the ship, this was an almost unimaginable change in circumstance. He was no longer an observer tolerated at the margins of someone else's voyage. He was, for the first time in his life, the one giving the orders, his name printed on official Admiralty papers. His years of hard-won, unglamorous knowledge of wind and current finally recognized as something worth funding. The voyage out was long, as these voyages always were. Down the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, across the wide emptiness of the Indian Ocean. But in early August of 1699, the coastline of Western Australia rose once again on the horizon, and Dampier found himself, for the second time in his life, looking upon the strange red shores of New Holland. This time, however, he had the freedom and the mandate to do what he had only managed in stolen fragments before, to actually explore. He guided the Roebuck into a wide, sheltered bay along the coast, and there, surrounded by waters teeming with an almost unsettling number of sharks, he gave the place a name that has endured for more than 3 centuries. He called it Shark Bay, and it remains known by that name to this day. A quiet, permanent fingerprint left on the map of Australia by a man who had once been an orphaned farm boy in Somerset. Dampier's time along the Western Australian coast produced some of the richest and most carefully detailed natural history writing of his entire career. He collected plant specimens with such care that several of them survive even now in British herbarium collections, among the oldest scientifically documented Australian plants in existence anywhere in the world. He described unfamiliar birds, strange fish, the particular quality of the light and the heat, the dry scrubland stretching away from the coast in every direction. He sailed northward along the coastline, charting and naming features as he went. A scattering of islands that would later be called the Dampier Archipelago, a stretch of coastline that would come to be known as Dampier Land, leaving his own name scattered across the map of a continent he had visited only twice, briefly, and never by more than a narrow margin of luck and circumstance. But the voyage that had begun with such promise was, almost from the outset, undermined by a problem that no amount of skill or curiosity could solve: the Roebuck herself. The ship had been old and poorly maintained even before she left England, her timbers already showing signs of the slow creeping rot that could doom a wooden vessel on a long voyage, and the demanding conditions of the journey only accelerated her decline. Dampier had intended to press onward and explore the eastern coast of New Holland as well, a stretch of shoreline that would not be properly charted by an Englishman until Captain Cook arrived more than 70 years later. But with his ship deteriorating beneath him and supplies running short, Dampier was forced to abandon that ambition, turning instead toward New Guinea, where he continued his careful work of charting and naming, discovering and recording the narrow strait that separates New Guinea from New Britain, a passage that today still carries his name. The Dampier Strait, one of several places around the world that quietly commemorate a voyage most of its own crew, very nearly did not survive. The return journey westward was, in its own way, the most harrowing chapter of the entire expedition. The Roebuck's condition continued to worsen with every week at sea, her hull taking on water faster than her exhausted crew could pump it out, until by February of 1701, somewhere in the lonely stretch of the South Atlantic near the remote volcanic outcrop of Ascension Island, it became clear that the ship simply was not going to survive the voyage home. Dampier made the decision to run her aground in a sheltered bay rather than lose her and crew entirely to the open ocean, and there, in the shallow waters of a barren, uninhabited island thousands of miles from anywhere resembling civilization, His Majesty's ship Roebuck quietly settled and sank. It is worth sitting for a moment with what this actually meant for the men aboard her. Ascension Island, in the year 71, was no tourist destination or naval waypoint. It was a remote, largely barren volcanic rock with no permanent population, no reliable fresh water beyond what could be found in a few scattered springs, and no certainty whatsoever that any other ship would happen to pass close enough to notice a stranded crew waving from its shore. For more than a month, Dampier and his men survived as best they could, hunting the wild goats that had been introduced to the island by earlier passing ships, catching turtles along the shoreline, rationing what little fresh water they could find, and watching the horizon each day for a sail that might or might not ever appear. It is precisely the kind of ordeal that would, a few years later, make Daniel Defoe's tale of a castaway alone on a desert island feel so vividly real to English readers. And it is worth remembering that Dampier himself, by this point in his life, had lived through more than one version of exactly that nightmare, long before any novelist ever put pen to paper. Eventually, mercifully, passing ships did appear, and Dampier and his surviving crew were rescued and carried back to England, arriving home in 1701 with a story of shipwreck and survival, but without the ship that had been entrusted to their commander's care. For most men, simply surviving the loss of one's vessel might have been the end of the story. For Dampier, it was only the beginning of a far more uncomfortable reckoning. In the months following his return, he was brought before a naval court-martial, not primarily over the loss of the Roebuck itself, which courts of the era generally treated with some sympathy given the ship's well-documented poor condition, but over his conduct toward one of his own officers during the outward voyage. Dampier had clashed bitterly with his lieutenant, a man named George Fisher, and in the heat of that conflict had Fisher placed in irons and, by most accounts, treated with a harshness that went well beyond what naval discipline of the time considered acceptable, eventually leaving him to be imprisoned by Portuguese colonial authorities in Brazil rather than carrying him onward with the rest of the crew. The court-martial that examined these events did not look kindly on Dampier's actions. He was found guilty of cruelty toward his officer, fined the whole of his pay for the voyage, and formally declared unfit ever again to command one of His Majesty's ships. It was, by any measure, a humiliating outcome for a man who had so recently been celebrated as England's most knowledgeable living authority on the Pacific Ocean and its uncharted coastlines. The same restless, sometimes harsh temperament that had carried a teenage orphan through buccaneer camps and jungle crossings and Spanish raids had, it seemed, never entirely left him, and it had now cost him the one fully legitimate command his extraordinary career had ever produced. And yet, in one of the more remarkable turns in this already remarkable life, the court-martial's judgment, unfit to command one of His Majesty's ships, did not mean unfit to sail at all. Dampier's knowledge of the Pacific, his charts, his decades of hard-earned experience navigating waters that almost no other living Englishman had ever crossed, remained simply too valuable to leave unused. Private investors, rather than the Royal Navy, would soon come calling instead, eager to put that knowledge to work in pursuit of Spanish treasure rather than scientific discovery. And it would be aboard one of these private, profit-driven expeditions that William Dampier would find himself sailing once more toward the Pacific, toward an encounter on a remote and lonely island with a marooned sailor whose own story would soon become far more famous than Dampier's name ever was. By now, William Dampier had been formally declared unfit to command one of His Majesty's ships. A humiliating verdict for a man who had once been celebrated as England's foremost living authority on the Pacific. And yet, as is so often the case with Dampier's life, disgrace in one arena did not mean the closing of every door. His knowledge remained too valuable to waste, and within a few short years, private investors came calling once again, eager to fund a privateering voyage against Spanish shipping in the very waters Dampier knew better than any other Englishman alive. In 1703, he set out once more, this time in actual command of a vessel called the Saint George, sailing in loose company with a second ship, the Cinque Ports, under a younger captain named Thomas Stradling. It was, in many ways, a repetition of the patterns that had defined so much of Dampier's career. Ambitious in concept, troubled in execution, quarrels broke out among the officers, as they so often had before, and the two ships eventually parted ways entirely, each continuing its own separate, increasingly difficult cruise along the Pacific coast of South America. Dampier's own voyage aboard the Saint-Oise, George produced little of lasting success. Plagued by poor discipline, disappointing plunder, and the same friction with subordinates that had already cost him his Navy commission once before. But it is the fate of the Cinque Ports, sailing somewhere beyond Dampier's direct command, that history would remember far longer than anything achieved by either ship's raiding. Aboard her served a Scottish sailing master named Alexander Selkirk, a skilled and strong-willed man who, after a bitter dispute with Captain Stradling over the seaworthiness of their vessel, made an extraordinary decision in the autumn of 1704, rather than continue aboard a ship he genuinely believed was unsafe. Selkirk asked to be put ashore on a small, uninhabited island called Juan Fernandez, off the coast of Chile, taking with him only his sea chest, his weapons, a few tools, and a Bible. He fully expected another ship would come along soon enough to collect him. None did, not for more than 4 years. It is worth pausing here, because the threads of this story are quietly tangled together in a way that rewards a closer look. Dampier was not aboard the ship that marooned Selkirk, and the two men's paths would not cross again on that island. But the world that produced Selkirk's extraordinary ordeal of solitary survival was the very same world Dampier had spent his entire adult life moving through. The same waters, the same loose, quarrelsome culture of privateering captains and restless crews, the same thin margin between disaster and survival that Dampier himself had walked along so many times before. And in a twist that feels almost too neat for fiction, it would be Dampier himself, several years later, who returned to those same waters and helped bring Selkirk's long ordeal to its end. That return came in 1708, when Dampier, his reputation as a commander still too damaged to be trusted with formal authority, was instead hired in a role that suited him far better than command ever had. As ship's pilot, the man whose unmatched knowledge of Pacific winds, currents, and coastlines would guide a far more capable and disciplined expedition than anything Dampier had led on his own. The voyage was organized by a sharp, methodical captain named Woodes Rogers, sailing 2 well-equipped privateering vessels, the Duke and the Duchess, with clear financial backing and a far more professional crew than Dampier had typically sailed with in his later years. It says something meaningful about Dampier's standing, even after every disgrace and court-martial, that an ambitious young commander like Rogers still wanted him aboard, not to give orders, but simply to know, with the quiet certainty of decades of hard experience, where the rocks lay hidden and which way the wind would turn. The expedition rounded Cape Horn in brutal winter conditions, the kind of crossing that had nearly killed Dampier more than once in his younger years, and emerged once again into the familiar waters of the Pacific. And in February of 1709, sailing toward the very same island where Selkirk had been left more than 4 years earlier, Rogers's crew spotted a signal fire burning on the shore of Juan Fernandez. What they found when they rowed ashore startled even men who had seen a great deal in their lives at sea: a wild-haired, goatskin-clad figure who could, at first, barely manage coherent speech, having spoken to no other human being in more than 50 months. It was Alexander Selkirk, alive against every reasonable expectation, having survived alone through sheer resourcefulness, hunting wild goats, building shelters, and slowly, deliberately, fighting to retain his sanity and his humanity through years of total isolation. Dampier, present aboard one of the rescuing ships, and already well known to Rogers as a man whose judgment about people, if not always about leadership, remained sharp, reportedly vouched for Selkirk's abilities as a seaman, and Selkirk was brought aboard, nursed back to health, and eventually given a position of real responsibility within the expedition's continuing voyage. It was an encounter that would, within a few short years, ripple outward into English literature in ways neither man could possibly have anticipated. When Daniel Defoe sat down to write the story of a castaway alone on a desert island, it was Selkirk's real ordeal, filtered, expanded, and reshaped, but unmistakably rooted in actual events. That gave him his foundation, And it was Dampier's own published travels, with their patient, detailed accounts of stranded sailors and desolate islands, that had already primed English readers to find such a story entirely believable. The voyage did not end with Selkirk's rescue. Rogers pressed onward, raiding Spanish shipping and settlements along the Pacific coast, much as Dampier's earlier expeditions had done, but with considerably more discipline and considerably better fortune. The campaign reached its triumphant climax in late 1709, when Rogers's ships succeeded in capturing a heavily laden Spanish galleon making its annual crossing from the Philippines to Mexico, one of the famous Manila galleons, vessels so richly loaded with Asian silks, porcelain, and treasure that a single successful capture could make an entire expedition extraordinarily profitable. After a hard-fought pursuit and engagement, the prize was secured, and the voyage that had begun with Dampier serving in the comparatively humble role of pilot ended as one of the most financially successful privateering expeditions of the entire era. From there, the expedition turned for home, threading its way across the Pacific, through the East Indies, and around the Cape of Good Hope, finally returning to England in October of 1711. For William Dampier, it marked something genuinely extraordinary, the completion of his third full circumnavigation of the globe, a feat no other Englishman of his time could claim even once, let alone 3 times over. Achieved across a career that had carried him from logwood camps and jungle crossings to official naval command, and finally to this last, most profitable voyage of his life. And yet, fittingly for a man whose story had never followed the conventional arc of triumph and reward, Dampier's final years brought him little of the comfort that such an achievement might suggest. The legal and financial settlement of the Rogers expedition's enormous prize dragged on slowly, tangled in disputes among investors, and Dampier appears to have received only a modest portion of the wealth his knowledge had helped secure, much of it owed to him still at the time of his death. He lived out his remaining years in London in relatively quiet, modest circumstances, a far cry from the Spanish treasure and Manila silks that had passed so close to his hands. And in March of 1715, William Dampier died in the city, at roughly the age of 63. The precise location of his grave was not carefully recorded, and today no one can say with certainty exactly where his body was laid to rest. A strangely understated end for a man whose name had, by then, already begun to spread itself permanently across the maps of 3 different oceans. His writings shaped 2 of the most enduring works in the English literary canon, lent foundational shape to the early science of oceanography, and even guided Captain Cook himself, who carried Dampier's charts and accounts of New Holland aboard ship more than half a century later. And scattered today across the map of the world, a strait between New Guinea and New Britain, an archipelago, and a stretch of land along the Australian coast, a peak in New Zealand, towns and bays on 3 different continents. His name remains quietly, permanently fixed to the geography he spent his life trying to understand. Every documentary eventually has to ask, in its closing moments, the same quiet question: what was the actual shape of the life we have just spent so many hours walking through? With William Dampier, that question resists any easy, tidy answer, and perhaps that resistance is itself the most honest thing we can say about him. Consider, for a moment, the company he is so often placed in. We tend to file explorers into a single, simplified category in our collective memory: Magellan, Drake, Cook, Columbus, bold men who sailed toward blank spaces on the map and returned, if they returned at all, having claimed something for a flag and a crown. Dampier does not fit comfortably into that lineage, and it is worth understanding exactly why. He never sailed under royal commission as a young man chasing glory. He never set out, in those early Caribbean years, with discovery as his stated purpose at all. He drifted into exploration sideways, through logwood camps and buccaneer raids and a restless inability to stay still, and it was only gradually, almost accidentally, that the careful habit of observation he had carried since boyhood transformed him into something history would eventually recognize as far more significant than just another opportunistic raider of Spanish shipping. That transformation is worth dwelling on a little longer, because it represents one of Dampier's quieter but more lasting contributions to human knowledge. In 1699, the same year he set out aboard the Roebuck, he published a second book, a more technical, less narrative work titled A Discourse of Winds, Breezes, Storms, Seasons, Tides, and Currents. It does not carry the same dramatic appeal as his tales of buccaneers and shipwrecks, and it is rarely read today outside of specialist circles, but in its own way it was genuinely groundbreaking. For the first time, an Englishman had attempted to systematically describe and classify the great wind patterns of the world's oceans, the trade winds, the monsoons, the seasonal shifts that governed when a ship could safely cross the Pacific or round the Cape of Good Hope. Based not on theory or second-hand report, but on years of direct first-hand observation accumulated across multiple oceans. Sailors and scientists alike would consult this work for generations. It represents, perhaps better than any single episode of raiding or shipwreck, the truest version of who Dampier actually was underneath all the more colorful drama. Not primarily a pirate who happened to notice the weather, but a working scientist who happened to have spent his working life aboard pirate ships, because pirate ships were simply where a poor farmer's orphaned son could find his way out to the parts of the world he most wanted to understand. This is, in the end, perhaps the most useful lens through which to view the entirety of William Dampier's life. The buccaneering, the raids, the Spanish treasure, the violent quarrels with subordinates that twice cost him his command. None of this was ever really the point for Dampier, so much as it was the price of admission. It was simply how a man without wealth, without noble birth, without patronage of any kind, managed to secure passage to the places his curiosity demanded he see. Compare this to a figure like Magellan, sailing with the full financial backing of the Spanish crown, or Cook, commissioned directly by the Royal Society and the Admiralty, together with clear scientific purpose from the very outset of his career. Dampier had no such advantages. He earned his access to the world's oceans, the only way available to a man of his station in the late 17th century, through violence, opportunism, and a willingness to live among the rough, lawless edges of empire. And then, almost in spite of that violent context, he produced some of the most careful, patient, scientifically valuable writing of his entire era. It is this particular tension that makes Dampier such an enduringly fascinating figure to historians, even more than 3 centuries after his death. He cannot be cleanly celebrated as a hero, given his genuine cruelty toward Lieutenant Fisher, his casual treatment of Prince Giulio as a commercial curiosity, and the dismissive attitudes he sometimes carried toward the indigenous peoples he encountered. But he equally cannot be dismissed as merely another opportunistic pirate of his age, given the sheer scale of what his careful observations contributed to science, literature, and cartography. He occupies an uncomfortable, genuinely human middle ground, exactly the kind of complicated figure that simpler legends tend to flatten into something more easily digestible, and exactly the kind of figure that a more honest telling of history insists on preserving in his full, contradictory complexity. What is perhaps most remarkable, looking back across the full sweep of his life one final time, is simply the scale of what a single largely self-taught observer managed to leave behind. 3 circumnavigations of the entire globe, at a time when most Englishmen never traveled more than a few days' journey from the village of their birth. The first written European descriptions of significant stretches of the Australian coastline, more than half a century before Cook's far more famous voyage. Specimens still preserved today in herbarium collections, carrying his name and his careful 17th century handwriting on their labels. The direct, traceable line of influence running through Robinson Crusoe and Gulliver's Travels, two works that helped define an entire era of English literature, a foundational text on global wind patterns that sailors relied upon for generations after his death, and scattered permanently across the map of the world. In Australia, in New Guinea, in the waters off South America, on islands and straits and small unassuming peaks most people will never visit. A name that began as nothing more than a Somerset farmer's surname, given to a boy who, by every reasonable expectation of his era, should have lived and died within a few miles of where he was born. He did not. Orphaned young, drawn first reluctantly and then irresistibly to the sea, he spent his life walking a narrow, dangerous line between criminal and scientist, between plunderer and patient observer of the natural world, and somehow managed to leave behind a body of work that mattered far more than the gold he occasionally helped to seize along the way. He died with relatively little money, in a grave whose precise location history has simply failed to preserve. And yet, his actual legacy, the quiet accumulation of careful notes taken across 3 full circuits of the Earth, has proven far more durable than any fortune could have been. Perhaps that is worth sitting with. As we bring this particular voyage of our own to its close, we tend to remember explorers for the moments of high drama. The storms survived, the treasure seized, the uncharted shores first glimpsed through morning haze. And Dampier certainly had his share of all of that, more than most men could survive even once, let alone repeatedly across more than 2 decades at sea. But what made him genuinely unusual, what separates him from so many of his contemporaries who chased the same horizons for the same reasons, was the quieter habit underneath all of it, the simple, stubborn discipline of taking out a notebook, again and again, in conditions that would have given almost anyone else every reasonable excuse to put it away, and writing down, as carefully and honestly as he could manage, what he was actually seeing. The wind, as we said at the very beginning of this story, eventually decides which way it wants to blow. For William Dampier, it blew him across 3 oceans, into jungles and deserts, and the company of marooned castaways, through naval battles and court-martials, and quiet, unglamorous years, cutting logwood in lawless coastal camps. It carried him further, and saw more of the Earth's surface than nearly any other man of his generation. And when it finally settled, when the long, restless voyage of his life at last came to its quiet, modest end in a London grave no one thought to carefully mark, it left behind something that has never stopped moving since. A body of careful observation that helped shape literature, science, and cartography for centuries afterward, still drifting quietly outward, the way a current continues long after the storm that first stirred it has passed.